Hi everyone, this is Rachel back with the Shades of Orange. Today I'm here to do a recommendation video of dystopian fiction, primarily dystopian science fiction. And this is a topic that I didn't think I actually had that many books to talk about. And then I started to make a list, and sure enough, I've read a lot more than I thought. There's definitely a lot of classics on this list, but also hopefully some newer, underhyped books that you may not have read yet. And it's an interesting topic for sure. I want to be clear before we get started that a lot of people confuse the term dystopian with post-apocalyptic. And honestly, I didn't look up a definition ahead of time, but I consider dystopian to be more about a futuristic society that has gone terribly wrong, while I consider post-apocalyptic to be more about a natural or environmental event like a meteorite or zombies or a virus, things like that. And again, these terms tend to get crossed over, but for the most part, I'm going to be talking about books that I feel fit into the dystopian genre, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of these books as well. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's go through some of the classics that I love and would recommend. The first one being 1984 by George Orwell, which I think is a book I read for the first time during high school. And this is set in what was a dystopian future, but of course in 1984 is when it's set, and we follow a dystopian government that is controlling all of the communications within this area, and we follow these citizens as they find out that Big Brother is always watching them. This is a book that I feel like pretty much everyone should read just for the sake of the references, because I feel like with this day and age, everyone is constantly throwing around that phrase, Big Brother is watching, but most people don't actually know the reference unless they've read the book, or at least they don't really understand the meaning behind it and just get the general idea. I am not a huge fan of classics, I'll be honest, but this one did work well for me. I do think that it's a really terrifying story, and despite the fact that it is of course written way back in the past, it is very telling and really has some interesting commentary, even again on today's society. So definitely one that you should read if you have not already. I'd love to hear from those of you in the comments if this is also one of your favorites. Next, I think I would lose my Canadian citizenship if I don't recommend The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This is set in a dystopian future where fertility has started to decline, and so those that do have fertile bodies are being used as property and controlled by those of the upper class that are more wealthy. We follow a young woman who is simply known as of Fred because she is the property of a man named Fred, and she is being used to basically bear his children in place of his wife. This book is absolutely terrifying for the fact that Margaret Atwood, as she does in all of her books, really draws on concepts and ideas that are already in place at the time that she is writing it. So while this is technically set in a far-flung future in this unknown dystopian nation, at the same time you see the threads of her story happening in the current day, and it's again terrifying. So I really like this one. I think that her prose are beautiful. This book is more literary in style, and I don't read a lot of literary fiction, but for whatever reason Margaret Atwood's writing style just works really well for me. So if that is something that has intimidated you, I definitely recommend trying this one out. It's beautiful and haunting, and I love it. And again, if you're Canadian, you basically have to read this book. So hopefully you will remedy that if you haven't already picked up this one for yourself. Then we have Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. This, of course, is set in a dystopian future where there are firefighters, but the firefighters are not in place to stop fires. In fact, their job is to start fires, particularly to burn down the homes where there are books in place. And so this is set in a future where it's all about the control of the media and consumption of different reading material and information. And I really like this book for so many reasons. I think that it's very funny in a strange way because there's a lot of satire written into the story. Again, having a firefighter who, instead of putting out fires, is causing them. And there's also a lot of really good predictions in this book. This again is a book I think I read after university, and I was just shocked to find out that for the time that it was written, the author predicted so many things. Like for instance, Twitter, he basically figured out the concept of Twitter. Obviously the internet didn't even exist at that point in time, but he was able to understand the fact that you would have people, instead of reading newspapers and books, would rather just have these small little concise snippets of information, and that is all that they would want, which is such a pet peeve of mine, that people don't actually read news articles, they just read the headlines and think that they've read the news. And so this book really addresses that, and I think it's really smart and funny. And I do think Ray Bradbury is just all around a really good author. He has great prose, which is straightforward, easy to follow. Again, a classic that is not intimidating. I don't read a lot of classics, but this one was super easy to get into and definitely an all-time favorite of mine. Highly recommend if you haven't checked it out before. Now, I do have to quickly mention Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and this is one I'm going to keep very short in terms of a synopsis because I read this back in high school and I don't remember loving it. Essentially, it's set in a future that is governed by a body that uses drugs to manipulate the population, and for whatever reason, all I remember about it is that I absolutely hated it. I know this is a terribly unpopular opinion, and I do blame my school system for that because I did find that pretty much everything I had to read for school I hated, and the books that I read on my own were actually the books I enjoyed. So I would love to hear some contradicting opinions. I know this book is super beloved, so try to give me a pitch for why I should reread it and revisit it as an adult, because I haven't wanted to touch it since then. I have such bad memories, but it's such an iconic classic and I couldn't exclude it from this list. So if you like dystopian future settings, you definitely want to check out this one for yourself. And yeah, convince me why I should reread it because I'm terrified to go back to it. I don't remember liking it at all. Then we have The Chrysalis by John Wyndham, and this is another book I read back in high school. And this is set in dystopian future where there has been some sort of what I believe is to be like nuclear fallout, and so we have different individuals struggling with kind of different mutations to their body. So you have people born with extra toes or different abilities or kind of features, and these people are not seen as acceptable in society. They are weeded out, and so we follow some young children that are trying to hide their mutations in order to survive. This book is so harrowing, so emotional. It is just this wonderful little story. It's very short and it's very memorable. Again, I read this book years and years ago and I'm still thinking about it today. I definitely want to reread it and would love to see more people picking it up because I don't know if it still gets as much love as it used to, but I think that this book is so iconic and it's definitely something that really surpasses its time, that it's a classic, that's a classic for a reason because I think it is just as relevant today as it was back when it was written. Next is one of my all-time favorite dystopians, and that is The Giver by Lois Lowry, which I believe is one of the very few young adult books on this list. For the most part, I read adult fiction, but there are a few dystopians that would technically be classified as young adult, or in this case, even children's fiction, maybe. But it deals with some very adult concepts, so I do think that this book has some really wide audience appeal. We are set in a future that appears to be a bit of a utopian. We have this great conformist society where everything is orderly and in place, and we follow a young boy who is now coming of age, and so he's about to be assigned the job that he will have throughout his life. He gets a very unusual position called the Giver, and we find out within the story that this position involves holding on to the memories that have been lost to the rest of society. This book just has the most amazing themes. It's very emotional and topical, and essentially just explores the idea of whether or not it is important to remember difficult things. So is it important to remember the atrocities of the past, the dark and disturbing things that have existed in our world and still exist today, or is it better to forget it and just move on? I, again, love the theming around this book and I just highly recommend it. I don't think I've ever continued on with the rest of the quartet, so if you do think the other books are worth reading and add to the story, I'd love to know. I've always treated it like a standalone and I've read it many, many times. Also, I want to recommend Tender is the Flesh, and this is a translated book from Argentina that is actually more of a horror novel, but it is also a dystopian. And so we're set in a future where animal meat has become inedible, it is dangerous, and so it can no longer be consumed. And so instead of becoming vegetarian or vegan, the population has decided to allow for the consumption of human meat. So the government has put in place what is called special meat, which can be bred and consumed. And so we follow someone who works in one of these shops and butchers the animals, aka humans. This book, if you can't tell from that synopsis, is absolutely gruesome and disturbing and messed up. And so naturally, I absolutely loved it. It is a very terrifying story. Again, I will say that it's more horror than science fiction in the fact that we really are more exploring these ideas to terrify the reader and have some really interesting conversations around our treatment of animals and just how we treat other life forms. So it's more conversation about that and less about why the society got to where it is. So you're not going to find a lot of explanations, but is it a gripping read? Absolutely. Will this book leave you devastated and disturbed and just thinking about it for days and wanting to hug a pillow or a puppy? Absolutely. This book is not for everyone. Lots of content warnings, but yeah, if you're up for it, if you can stomach it, I highly, highly recommend this one. One of my all-time favorites again. Then I want to quickly mention The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, which is one of the few YA books on this list again. And this, of course, is the first book in the iconic trilogy following Katniss, who agrees to go into the Hunger Games to save her sister. And these games involve her having to fight to the death with other children in order to survive. And this is an example of a dystopian book that was very enjoyable to read at the time. I'll admit, I think I read it in college, and I remember really enjoying the story. I was sucked into it. I wanted to know what was going to happen, who was going to survive. But looking back now, I have a lot less love for this book, and it's just my problem in general with YA dystopians, or at least modern YA dystopians, is the fact that they tend to have these really crazy setups, but I feel like the setups are just in place in order for the plot to happen. And when you actually look at the reasoning behind it all, you find out that there is very little substance there, so we never get to find out the reasoning that the society is like this. And I feel like this book doesn't really take the time to explore a lot of like ideologies or different themes, and instead it's just a really exciting adventure. So I can't pretend I didn't enjoy this book, because I did when I read it, but I don't think that this is the best place to go if you're looking for really deep dystopian fiction, or I don't think it's representative of the depth of the genre. So had to mention it because it's fun, but yeah, moving right along. I also want to mention The Memory Police, which is another translated book, and this is set in a dystopian future where the government has found the ability to remove certain memories of objects and places from people's minds. And so we follow someone who has a strange ability to somewhat hold on to the memories of things that other people have forgotten. This is much more of a thought experiment than some of the other books on this list. So for me, as a reader who really likes to know answers, I really like to know the science and explanations behind things, you're not going to get that here. So I wanted to know how people were forgetting about these things, and instead it's much more an exploration of how those ideas would manifest and what that would cause a society to do. And so I like this one. I didn't personally love it, but I also think it's a very interesting, unique novel. And so again, if you're looking for something very literary, very smart, very different, this is one that you may want to check out, and hopefully you will enjoy it even more than I did. Finally, I want to talk about The City Inside by Semet Basu. This is a short novel that is ultra modern. It's set in New Delhi in a near future, and we follow a woman who works as a social media manager. So she is not an influencer per se, but she manages the influencers' online presence and just, helps with all their social media accounts. Now, this is a very classic dystopian setup where we have a government that is controlling everyone. They are the watchdogs, think Big Brother once again, where they are keeping tabs on everyone's social media feeds and what they're saying out loud and in public and so forth. This book is also topical with what is happening over in China, and I think that it works very well with the modern age where we are putting a lot of ourselves online, and you get to see the consequences of that if you do have a government in place that is looking to use that for their own purposes. And so I thought the world building in this was amazing. I was gripped in. I thought it was interesting and complex, and definitely the kind of book that will just keep you thinking about it long after you finish. So highly recommend this one. I feel like it's not as hyped up as some of the classics that you probably heard about earlier in this video, but if you haven't yet read this one, it's another one I really did enjoy and would love to see more people picking up. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out? Please convince me that I should read Brave New World again, or maybe please don't. I really don't want to read it, but if enough of you are interested in me revisiting it, I certainly will give it another try. Otherwise, I would love to hear what your favorite dystopian novel is, especially if it's one that I did not mention here, because I'd love to do a follow-up video with this, perhaps focusing more again on modern dystopians that might be a little bit more underhyped. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of science fiction, fantasy, horror, and thrillers, and you can help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online, dropping a little emoji. Oh, what's an emoji for a dystopian? I don't know, a building or like a government? I don't know. You'll figure something out. Be creative. Otherwise, if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.